We are very pleased to kick off our spring semester weekly seminars with our students who is in the School of Business, Real Estate, and Urban Land Economics. And we're not going to hear as much about this today, but Chris also does really interesting work thinking about how to measure and study key public goods in an economic framework like air quality and brownfields. So lots of fascinating research to explore if you're not already familiar with Chris's work. A couple bits of housekeeping. One is that clock isn't accurate, so don't look at it to decide how long we're going to be here. And the second is that we're doing the seminar econ style today, so you can ask questions whenever your heart desires. And I will turn things over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to kick it off. And hopefully lots of questions. This is a paper that I've been working on for a couple of years now, and we're trying to wrap up. If you've had a paper like that that sort of never goes away and kind of keeps reappearing, you'll be sympathetic to where we're at. But please jump in. The topic that I'm going to talk about today is a discrimination paper, but it's a little different from some of the other discrimination work that I'm involved in with different co-authors at different places. This one in particular is about a very specific kind of housing transaction. Okay, and this is one that you would think about in the context of climate adaptation. Okay, in particular, where things are getting worse from a flooding point of view. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, you could start to insert wildfire for flood. And a lot of the same arguments would probably apply, although that would be an interesting, the data to look at that isn't quite there yet. But something that I think we're interested in. But flooding is generally getting worse. Okay, so we're going to be talking today about ways in which we adapt to that by trying to move people away, right, from flooding spaces, and the structural problems that can exist in a program like that that can lead to biases. Okay, so nothing I'm going to talk about today will really, be explicit evidence of outright discrimination. It'll be evidence, hopefully, that you'll agree will be evidence of a discriminatory impact, possibly. Okay, and this is a discriminatory impact from a government agency, okay, or government agencies in the plural. And we're going to argue that that's going to come probably out of a variety of structural factors in the way that programs work. Okay, not necessarily somebody sitting down and intending to be discriminatory. But all that being said, that would still be a problem. That would actually still violate the law, right? If that were the case, so something we need to think about. There was a nice paper that came out when we were just, into this project. That was a few years back now in 2022. Carolyn Kuski and other co-authors looked at sort of where things are going in the future with respect to flood risk. Okay, and it's a nice way to just motivate things because if you look around the world today, there's not actually a really strong correlation in most research that you'll look at between race and flood risk. There's a little bit, but it's not as stark as you might think. Okay, in particular, there's a lot of low-income white residents living in rural places that flood a lot. Okay, that's changing under the predictions. If you look going forward, we're expecting to see quite a bit more flooding, and that's going to both be from sort of the sea level view of things, right? They're talking about, we could have 13 million people exposed to regular sea level flooding risk by the end of this century. But we're also talking, probably more relevant for this paper and this discussion, is about rainfall-driven flooding, right? Or river-driven flooding. Won't get into the super technical terms, but there we're talking about a lot more people who haven't been exposed before. These are oftentimes people who are in low-income places. This might be people who have been sort of segregated into parts of communities based on historical discrimination that are low-lying areas that might flood more often. So there we're looking at up to maybe 12 million more people who are going to be at risk of flooding from those sorts of events. And they're going to primarily be disproportionately more people of color. Okay, so we are motivated to think about the way race interacts with a program like a buyout, right? Where we're looking to come in and sort of rescue people from this situation, make them whole and able to move someplace that's going to be less risky. Okay, so that's sort of the motivation and where race is going to kick in. There's a variety of things we can do for flood risk, right? This is sort of the adaptation response to growing flood risk. We can flood proof, right? We can raise houses up on stilts. There's people working on what that does to house value. Right now, that's a research topic people are looking into. We can provide good price signals, which we don't necessarily do with flood insurance now. Flood insurance is really subsidized, right? Which can be a good thing from an equity point of view, but it's not necessarily a great thing from stopping people from wanting to live in places that are going to be at flood risk. We can come in ex post, right? Now we're getting into the FEMA part of things. We can come in ex post and clean things up and give people payments to help them get over a difficult time and help them rebuild. That's not really a flood insurance approach, but they both help people sort of bounce back. Or we can do the buyout, the managed retreat, right, which is more preemptive in some cases, right, where you can come in and buy out properties before they flood, or more often what ends up happening is we come in after the flood has happened, and rather than having somebody rebuild, we suggest to them, why don't you just take this payment, we'll knock it down flat, and you can go rebuild somewhere else, buy a house somewhere else, okay? And most of those buyouts happen, there's a couple of different programs that do this, but the one we're gonna focus on is the big one, and it's the one that FEMA will go out and administer, and that's the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the HMGP, okay? And there's some peculiarities to the way it works, and I need to talk through a few of them in order to help set up the structural discrimination argument that I want to make, because they're going to come through the way that program in particular works. All right, but the essence of the analysis will be the following. We're going to first try to figure out how do buyouts pay out to different groups. Okay, so is there a bias in what you receive relative to what your house is going to be worth? All right, to do that, we're going to have to get a really good estimate of what your house would be worth in order to say whether what you received is off from that, right? So it's going to be a really carefully done, hopefully you'll agree, carefully done hedonic analysis. All right, fairly straightforward and simple. We're not trying to recover willingness to pay or anything here. It's a prediction of a house value, okay? And then we're going to compare that to across different racial groups, the owners of those houses, and see how the difference between what they should have gotten, what they did get, varies, okay? I'll come back later to a few sort of, you might be interested in whether race explains all of that, or whether other things, other covariates that go along with race might matter. We'll get to that, okay? So bear with me a little until I get to the end of the talk if you've got questions along those lines. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to start seeing, well, what are the implications of those discounts, right? The bias that we're going to measure there. So, just spoiler alert, there is a bias. You probably got that from the title. But what does that actually do to people, right? Where they end up going. And this is going to be very descriptive. It's not a structural model. We're not measuring welfare effects, in utility terms. We're going to measure the change in the neighborhood characteristics where people live. Pretty straightforward sort of thing to do, okay? And we're going to see that the relocation is actually affected pretty significantly by that discount, okay? And that varies by race. So there's going to be an interaction between the first thing there, okay? Getting less money and race together are going to combine to produce something worse. Yes.
Is there any competition in terms of wanting to buy out? Like, is it only federal agencies that want to buy out individuals after a disaster, or are there any private?
There's not really a private market, nothing I'm aware of. This is more of the feds come in. Because in the end, when you buy out a property, you have to turn the land into unused open space.
Oh, okay.
There's not a lot of market for unused open space. I'll show you some pictures in a bit of kind of like what they can do with that, but it generally is going to be publicly owned kind of space. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the HMGP, this is the program that we're going to be talking about. So this is a picture over here of places that were bought out after Hurricane Superstorm Sandy. Okay, so this is, I believe, probably Brooklyn, or maybe Staten Island, but we're talking the New York area there. And that's what a house would look like ex post following the disaster. Before, it's not really the feds coming in to do this. They're going to work with the local government. They're going to come in and start making offers to people. Okay. So the state or local government has to be the group that does the application for a buyout, right? They go to the feds and say, we'd like to do buyouts here in our community. And in order to justify being able to do that, they have to show that they can pass a cost benefit analysis, right? So FEMA, when they authorize the funds to go into the buyout, you have to be able to show that the way you're going to use them is actually going to reduce future costs. And the future costs could be not having to rescue people from a flood, could be not having people die, right? You can build in the weighted death risk into your cost benefit analysis. It could be that if you take out an entire neighborhood, you don't have to provide water and sewer to that neighborhood anymore. And that's a reduction in the costs to the community, right? So these are all benefits that you use to justify. And that last one I mentioned, if you think about it, having one holdout at the end of a long street who refuses to buy out could be really costly to you in this sense, because now you still have to run that sewer line, right? So there's a benefit here to getting everybody to join in a group, right? And that can lead to pressure. And we're going to see in a bit that some people will say in surveys that they felt coerced into participating in a buyout, which kind of starts to then raise questions about whether they benefited from it or not. Yeah, question.
They count like foregone flood insurance payouts as a benefit.
In terms of the federal government getting those payments,
Have to keep paying out for repeat floods in these.
that part, the not paying out the payouts would be a benefit that they could argue. Yeah, that would be a benefit not to the local government though. So I think most of the cost benefit analysis specifically is local, right? But I think that it is, nobody would dispute that that's kind of why they're doing it, is to not have to pay out flood payments anymore, right? So this is going to be a reason why in the end, they're going to look for low income places. They're going to look for places where you can get more houses bought out, right, for a given amount of money. And that's going to steer them into certain kinds of neighborhoods. And when you look into where these things happen, generally there's a pretty big literature on this. They tend to happen in, buyouts happen more often in neighborhoods of color and in low income places, okay? Which could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. That's what we're gonna get into next, yeah.
Can you use eminent domain to solve the holdout problem? Or is there a federal prohibition on using those funds?
You're not supposed to use eminent domain. They do say that, you see it come up here and there where I think you can make an argument for it, but no, it's not part of the legislation. It's not supposed to be something that you can be coerced into. I think if there's, yeah, it gets murky from what I've been able to read, but yeah, there are some circumstances where you can sort of force people into it if it's a really, 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 really bad flood risk, but that's not a great explanation of a murky policy. Sorry. Okay. All right. So I get to, okay. Yeah. This can only happen. There's a few rules. It can only happen when the president declares a disaster. Right. So there's a little bit of top down regulation about when this can go on. And it does require the local community to kick in, right? They have to pay up to at least a federal, 25% cost share with the federal money.
Homeowners, can they negotiate their buyout, or is it just kind of take it or leave it? They get
Now they can negotiate. I'll give you some specifics of how negotiation will work. The data that we're gonna have is gonna show the final price, right? But there are elements that you can negotiate, and we're gonna argue that's probably part of what we end up seeing in terms of differences. Okay, so then once you, the process then is the property owner will get an offer that they can take or leave, but there's gonna be an element there where they can come back and complain about part of the offer if they want. Under that, once it's accepted, the property is either demolished or you can move it. Right? So some people are really attached to their house and they'll pick it up and set it down somewhere else. And then after that, the land is restricted to not be built upon again, right? So you can do things with it. And what cities will often do is recreational space, baseball field, can be a wetland, something that can flood easily and then drain away, collect water, right? And keep the water from flowing into other people's houses. This is an example here from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. So a lot of people have worked on this legislation in the past, have been at UNC, and they've studied here. This is a dog park in Rocky Mount that used to be a neighborhood. Okay, so the dog park is a great example of something that you can do with the community space, right? That will be useful up until the time that it's flooding, and then you just wait for it to dry out. Okay, these are we're going to use in a few minutes the buyouts. The FEMA buyouts that were FOIA'd by NPR back in the middle part of the last decade. There's a big data set that's out there. It's publicly available now. Anybody can get it. It's messy. It's very messy, which is why everybody's just not using it right off the bat. But what's interesting about it is that if you look at where the buyouts occur, right, they're not all just along the coast, right? Many of them are in the interior, probably. I mean, there's a lot of them around the Mississippi and the Ohio River, but there's plenty of them in Arizona, right? And so there's places that flood because it rains a lot. The rain doesn't have anywhere to go, okay? Or because you've developed the land a lot and that makes the rain all, congregate in one place and it ends up flooding. So we're not specifically just talking about beach houses, okay? Which probably sometimes that's a perception people come into these discussions with. And you want to get around that perception because the people living in the beach houses can be very different from the people living along the Ohio River, right, where these buyouts are taking place. So from a socio-demographic point of view. But aside from that, we can talk a little bit about the way the data look and the problems with them in a few minutes. Okay, so I did mention this benefit cost analysis that you do, right? And you do have to come in and prove that the buyouts are going to be worth it in terms of avoided death, avoided property loss, things like that, okay? And possibly from the reduction of public services that you're going to have to provide, okay? So that's all going to lead to an emphasis on doing buyouts in low socioeconomic places, right? Places where the housing prices are lower, you can get more bang for your buck in terms of the number of people you move out. That's a good thing. And if these things were all being done very voluntarily, right? If everybody was choosing to participate and they were targeting the funds to low-income neighborhoods, we'd say that's pretty progressive policy. Assuming that the people get enough money to move to a place that's going to be safer, right? Where they're not going to have shocks that are going to, damage their wealth in the future. That would be a great thing. So where are we going to deviate from that? Where's the problem going to kick in? So if buyouts are voluntary, which they should be in legal terms, then things are great. But plenty of research out there suggests that they're not. So we cite one survey that was done back in the previous decade, where they found about a third of the participants in buyout programs said that they felt forced into it. Okay, so this study gets cited a lot. Because if it's not voluntary, right, then we start to worry about the welfare. Is this actually good or not? It's very likely not. Yeah, Mara, and then sir.
On the federal side, what's the, do the funds have to be used or they expire? What's the incentive on the federal side to use it? You know, is it use it or lose it type of a mechanism? Just what's the
From like FEMA's point of
Yes,
view.
yes.
I mean, they build up a stock of money and then there's a big disaster. And then they have to spend it down and then they build it up. So I don't think it's a
Have to
use it
spend it
or
down
lose it thing,
Disaster.
right? Because you don't have a big hurricane every year. This isn't sort of something where the money we're talking about isn't like a regular program where you go out every year and try to buy out houses. This is primarily in response to a disaster event.
Yeah. So do the FEMA folks have talk to me about disaster psychology. You know, put me in the heads of the FEMA people. You know, they must, I don't know anything about this. So do they want to, there's a disaster and they want to talk me through their incentives, you know, just.
Yeah, I mean, the FEMA people, I think they're just gonna take an application. The local people, I think, are gonna wanna get as much money as they can and spend it, right? That's I think where the motivation part that you're thinking about is more the local government. And they really wanna go out and get as much bang for their buck as they can out of this. So they're gonna go out and try to get the last guy at the end of the street
I see.
to sell, right? And that's where the coerciveness kicks in, or what people, where they think it's likely.
Thank you. Yeah, I understand.
Okay, and then, yeah.
I just had a question about what this feeling forced was, like if you knew anything else about what those people were, the question people were responding to on the survey, because you could imagine someone might feel like, I didn't want to do this, I had to do it because I couldn't stay living here. And that's a really different kind of being forced than
Yeah, no, this
somebody came and strong-armed me and
is
harassed.
somebody, yeah, I should have, if I'm gonna rely on this, I should actually throw the question in the slide. I don't have them up here. But it's the latter. If you read through the survey, it's people not saying, I was forced by nature into doing this, but I'm glad I can do it. It's people saying I didn't want to sell my house, but all my neighbors did and they told me I had to. Right. To paraphrase. Yeah. I think there was one back here and yeah.
This is post-disaster then, like what's kind of the alternative if like I'm sitting trying to decide to take a buyout or not? Is the alternative I get like disaster assistance from FEMA to rebuild, or?
So no, you would get flood insurance payments to rebuild if you had an active policy, up to $250,000, unless there is a market out there. We're sitting next to you can tell you about the market for private flood insurance. Working on this too. There's a market out there where you can sort of top off your federal insurance, but that's primarily used by higher income richer people. The problem is going to be there's an interaction between the payments from the flood insurance and the buyout, which I'll get to in a minute. It's a little bit weird, but it's a government program. There's lots of potential for weird things, so we'll get to that. But yeah, your option is basically to rebuild, but there may be some constraints on your ability to do that. Those constraints might hit differently depending upon who you are. Okay, so we'll get to that too. Question?
So is it only in a case where a very major disaster like Hurricane Sandy happens? Or has this program also been used in instances where a community was hit with floods multiple times to the point that they are like in a danger zone?
Yeah, it's the latter. I mean, you get the headlines out of the Hurricane Sandy, but I'll just go back to that picture again, right? There's a lot of space in there that's your average heavy rainfall repeatedly saying now it's time to get these people out of that area. Yeah, sure.
So is this, sorry, is this all post-disaster buyouts? There's no
What we're talking about here is post-disaster buyouts. Yeah, there are programs that will allow for disaster buyouts. The data we have here is post-disaster. So yes.
I have two questions. One is, when you're thinking about the impacts of rainfall, are you like, does this only consider flooding from rivers, or like, for example, if it rains 30 inches in the mountains, that could cause mudslides and landslides? Does that get factored in at all?
Yeah, I mean, that can be a reason why you would get a buyout from heavy rainfall flooding. There are a few, so you're trying to tell the federal government we have justification for buying out this house. There's a couple things that get you over the hurdle very quickly. One is if you're in a river zone that floods a lot, river vine flooding. the terminology. So if you're in a place that repeatedly the river comes out of its banks, you kind of get a free pass. Yes, you can include that house. It's maybe a little more difficult if it's just you're up in the mountains and it floods a lot and the water seems to accumulate here and there's a lot of mudslides and things like that. You can still justify that, but it's not automatic, like being within a river that comes out of its banks.
And then my second question is, do you ever see a tension between like local governments not wanting to participate? Are they like worried about losing their tax base or anything like that? And are there restrictions on where people relocate?
Yeah, so a lot of the like this literature that I was referring to with the dog park paper, a lot of that gets into questions about tax base. So I'm not really touching on that because we're not going to talk about why this community and not that community is part of what we're going to do. But that's actually a big part of what people look at. And yeah, you take out a bunch of houses and that costs you money. So that's part of that's a downside to go along with the, no more public services that you have to provide, but no more tax revenue coming in either. So definitely. Yeah. Is there one more question? No. Okay. All right. So thank you for those. Let me, yeah, here. So I was mentioning a minute ago that there's some features, right, that can make it in the end, that parts of the law can hit differently depending upon who you are in terms of whether you have free choice to do this or not, right? If you're sitting there and you're trying to decide, do I want to rebuild or do I want to take a buyout? There's a few things you have to consider. So one is if the damage is really bad, a lot of the houses in an area, the government, the local government can come in, like in this case, it would probably be the state would come in and make a substantial damage declaration, okay? What that does is it basically says that if the cost of repairing your house is more than 50% of its value, if you want to rebuild, you have to basically make it flood proof, okay? Which may mean you can't rebuild at all if you're in a place where that's just not feasible. It may mean that you have to elevate the house, right? You have to do some landscaping and things like that to make it so it's not going to flood again. But in general, that's going to make it really expensive if you can do it at all, and you may not be able to. Lower valued homes are going to be the homes, right, that are going to get over that 50% damage declaration faster. It's easier to have half of your value of your home be gone when your home is worth less in the first place. And your home was probably less resilient to the flood if it was lower priced to begin with, okay? And if you're poor, you're probably not going to be able to afford the repairs as much as somebody who's wealthier can anyway, right? So this is going to be something where if that declaration kicks in, lower income people are more likely to be coerced or more likely to feel like they end up having to do the buyout, right? Rebuilding is going to be less of an option if you have a substantial damage declaration. Second thing that can end up happening is that when there's a big flood, oftentimes the government will say you can't come back for a while, right? This isn't just floods. We saw this in LA a week ago where the government is saying you can't come back, it's dangerous. We don't have working public services yet, you have to stay away. I mean, in Hurricane Katrina times, this was months and months and months where people were living out in different parts of the country. The problem then becomes a question of liquid assets and savings, right? If you're delayed in your ability to rebuild, you just think what you're going to be doing, you're going to be living in a hotel, right? Or you're going to be finding short-term accommodation. You can do that for longer and wait until it's okay to come back if you've got money sitting around in a liquid savings account that you can tap, right? There are massive differences by race in the US, by income too, but big by race in terms of liquid assets and your ability to handle a shock, okay? So you're gonna be more likely to take the buyout offer quicker if you can't afford to just sit around and wait for the government to say, yes, it's time to come back and rebuild, right? So these are the kinds of things that we're thinking could be steering people in these directions. Now, the last one is the one about social capital and about bargaining, okay? So here, we haven't really talked about, can you respond to your offer? And what does that look like? So there's two ways in which your offer can be adjusted. One is the weird part of the government program. I said I'd get to that, the weird thing in a minute. Basically, if you get money from your federal insurance policy, from the NFIP, and you save it and you keep it, that gets deducted from your offer. Okay, you're not allowed to get paid by the federal government twice, basically. So if they give you $250,000 and you put that into your bank account, they're going to deduct that from what they're going to offer you to buy your house out. The weird thing is that if you take that money and you use it to go to Home Depot and buy things to fix up your house, then it doesn't come out of your buyout payment, right? So fixing up your house before they bulldoze it and turn it into a dog park, totally okay. Simplifying here, but this is just the kind of thing that happens, right? I think, and there's probably a reason for why that's in there. I don't want to, but a little bit odd. But you may find that some people are better able to justify the deductions than other people, right? So, and this is where this is kind of murky, but we think of this as a social capital sort of thing. So you're sitting there, talking to your local government official. This is not a federal official talking to you, somebody from the local government, and you're arguing with them about the fact that, yes, you did spend this money on home improvement and it therefore shouldn't come out of your buyout payment. Okay. In some parts of the country, you're in a better position to argue with the local government authority than in other parts of the country, depending upon who you are. That's the simple case that I'm making here. Okay. Same idea kind of comes on the flip side. So that's the deductions. But on the flip side, you can argue that you can't go out and buy your current house somewhere else with that amount of money. You can say, this isn't enough, I need more. I think it's $31,000 you can ask for in addition to the buyout, right? If you feel like you have the agency to argue with your local government official to get that. Okay, this is where it's just plain and simple bargaining. And there are bargaining costs and the abilities to engage in bargaining. And yeah.
To what extent do people employ agents to do this bargaining on their behalf?
So if you can afford lawyers, people use lawyers. We don't see any of that in the outcomes that we're able to see in the FOIA FEMA data. But you would think.
Can't see if they used a lawyer?
You can't see if they used a lawyer. But you kind of have a sense of who would be using a lawyer, right? I've done other work looking at the outcomes of shale gas drilling leases and who has protections built in and who doesn't. And they're talking to the people in Texas who worked in this industry. They would say, yeah, all of the rich white folks had lawyers going over all of their lease agreements. And then we go into these neighborhoods of color, lots of lower income people. They don't have anybody looking at them and they get walked all over, right? And we would find that in the outcomes. So yeah, but you'd never actually see if a lawyer did anything. That's the problem. So yeah, that's probably just another part of bargaining costs and bargaining ability. Yeah.
Yeah, the initial offer, is that, so it's tied to the pre-disaster market value. Are they just reading that off of like tax assessment rolls, or they're gonna do hedonic or something to get that?
I don't think they're gonna do as good of a hedonic analysis as we did, but they're getting it off of something that's probably an assessor.
So is part of
value.
is there's a literature on like racial disparities in tax assessments. If they're just translating that into this,
that could be easily another story, right? That would work itself in.
Well, I guess I'd probably go the other way though, right? Because if
the appraisals are low, the assessments are high, right? Yeah. And we're probably talking not about appraisals. We are probably talking about assessors who would say that this is how much the house is worth, right? So yeah, if anything,
have higher offers.
The assessment story, the bias in assessments would say this would raise their value even higher. But they're not really clear on where their value comes from. The thing they have sitting in their files though is the assessment. So that's probably part of it, yeah.
To what extent is the pre-existing flood risk like capitalized into the assessments that they use for the?
Yeah, great question. So we're going to use So it should be, but it may not be. That's the answer to your question. We're gonna use right now very localized fixed effects to try to account for that. We're in the process. When I say I've been working on this paper for 3 years and I see we're still in the process of doing anything, it makes me wince. But we are in the process of digitizing all of the flood maps so that we can go in and put in where the house is relative to, is it in or is it out? We're gonna want that for something else later too. But then we can include that in our hedonic analysis, right? So to build that in case it is being priced in. For now, we're gonna have block group by year fixed effects, which is as local as we can get and still estimate things. It's not gonna be perfect, but it's gonna capture a lot of what constitutes a flood risk. You hit a good point, right? Because in places where they're buying out, there probably is a flood risk that can push the value down. Okay. All right. Okay. So how am I doing on time? Okay, I think we're good. The data, okay, I mentioned earlier, we're using this data set that NPR, I don't know why it was NPR, but NPR FOIA'd all of the transaction records from all of the buyouts that had occurred up until the middle part of the last decade. I guess it was up latter part 2017. And in this data, you get an address, like it's written out, the full address, the year when it happened, you get a name, often, sometimes they're missing. You get the price that FEMA said was paid. Oftentimes that number is blank. In fact, not really often, I'd say the majority of the time that number is blank. Okay, so we'll have to deal with that. You learn about owner occupancy, so you know if this is a rented unit, okay? Because we don't want to be using the race of the renter when we're talking about this. We'd like to know about the race of the owner, and if it's a rental unit, we think about sometimes it's a second property for a homeowner. We want to get rid of those. And then you learn a little bit about the house structure. But the data that we're going to use, we're going to augment this by matching all of this to CoreLogic transactions data. Okay, data that we have in the business school here now. Everybody's welcome to use it. For that data set, you want to get in touch with Diane Zhang, not with me. He's the one who has that. Info USA will come to later. Come talk to me about that one. Try to divvy up the work. But with that, we're going to be able to go in and find every one of these transactions. And then we're going to use the price that we see in the transaction of the deed in CoreLogic, not what FEMA told NPR was the price. We fear it's a slightly better measure. Okay. Okay. So the CoreLogic data, this is one of these, Atom, CoreLogic, used to be Zillow. The kinds of data sets that you could get that describe all the transactions in the country, except for places like Texas, where you don't actually have to go report your price to the local county when you sell your house. But in general, these are pretty good data about the characteristics of the house and all the sales details. Okay, so yeah, we're going to identify all of the FEMA sales in CoreLogic, and this is an address match, right? Which is messy. So I want to start to get in your mind that the data here are not clean, okay? Occasionally, FEMA writes down the address as something like, 6 miles past the chicken farm. It's not always 123 Main Street. So you're dealing with data that sometimes you have to throw out, and you'll see in a minute where we throw out some data. But we do that match, we get all of those, and then we can get a good price measure, good date of sale, things like that. We're going to want to, in the end, follow people around, right? So one of the key features here is, what does the discount that we're going to find people getting imply for their life, where they end up? Does it drive them into a worse scenario? So we're in the process right now. Again, another thing we're in the process of doing is bringing in census data to do this. Okay, so the data to follow people in census is getting better and better all the time and easier to use. Okay, so PICS and MAF data, if you're familiar with these terms. when we started this, we didn't have that. Okay, so we're using the alternative, which is marketing data. Okay, so the data that you buy if you're a company and you want to be able to find out where people live so you can sell them things. And then when they move somewhere else, you want to be able to track them and continue to sell them things, right? Or what InfoUSA is very big on is they sell addresses to debt collectors. So you can owe a company money and they'll call you up and try to get you to pay, and then you might move and think you're free and clear. But InfoUSA finds you and gives your address to the debt collector again, right? So that they can keep asking you for money. So they're very good at following people around. Okay, they're not so great necessarily on measuring all of your attributes. Because InfoUSA doesn't come to your house and ask you what your race is, like census does, right? InfoUSA imputes your race, and they impute a lot of other things about you that we're going to use, and that's sort of the downside of the data, which is why getting census in will be nice. Okay, but we'll get to that in a minute and kind of how we use it. I'll come back to this wealth finder, the wealth score. We're going to use this as an indicator of impacts on people. We're going to look at their income and their wealth. InfoUSA doesn't go, like I said, they don't go out and ask you what your wealth is. Census doesn't ask you what your wealth is either. There's other things people use to try to get at that. But what InfoUSA does do is they track a lot of the things you buy, and I'll give you an example in a second. And from that, they impute what category of the wealth distribution you're in. Okay, so according to 20 or 30 different things, they put you into one of 20 bins based on sort of, purchases. And then from that, they say, well, you're in the top or the middle or the bottom wealth bin. You live here, the wealth distribution in that place looks like this. So we're going to impute a wealth to you. Okay, here's some examples of the things that they keep track of. They look a lot at your charitable donations. They know if you buy a lot of wine, they know what kind of car you drive, if you're a frequent book buyer, right? This is kind of what we're all being monitored with right now. So anyway, we're going to use the data hopefully for something better than debt collection. Okay. But in general,
We're on the books and wine, not the luxury.
Well, graduate students are really throwing them off.
I love the country club designation. Anyway, so when we come to the InfoUSA and the wealth index later, you'll know what I'm talking about. Then we've got some American Community Survey data, because we're going to want to characterize census tracts later. Okay, so I mentioned the data can be messy. Just to give you a sense of what that does to us, here's the data cuts that we have to make. So I mentioned we start at 44,000 buyouts. A lot of those buyouts happened prior to the year 2000. Okay, we cut that off because CoreLogic's coverage of a lot of these places is not great prior to 2000. So we're never going to match those to CoreLogic data. That takes us down to 14,480 that are since 2000. Okay, from there, we want to be able to predict prices for all of these houses that are in the FEMA buyouts. And I'll get to that regression in a second, but we can't run the regression we want to run on all the houses because there's not enough data. All right, and in particular, we're going to run a separate regression for every county where there's a buyout, because we want the coefficients in the hedonic regression to be really localized. This is really just pure prediction. We're not trying to get at anything structural in terms of preferences or things like that. So we can't match all of the data. Remember the chicken farm address I mentioned? We can't match all of them. And when we can't always run the regression. So we go down to 6,892 observations. Okay, that's kind of our working data set with CoreLogic. Then I mentioned the race variable, which is kind of our key thing. Race comes from InfoUSA. They use primarily your name and your location, but a lot of other things. I already showed you the stuff they monitor about you. They predict what your race is going to be, and we're going to use that data. And when we do that prediction, we're going to lose about another, I don't know, not actually very many. Now we're losing about 60 people out of 6,800. because Info USA can't tell us accurately enough what the person's race is. Okay? There's still problems using imputed race. We just say that now, and I agree with you. This is why we want to use the census data, because it's self-stated race. It's better. And you can start to get into that now. But anyway, that's what I'm going to show you our results using that. Then you get into adding in the Info USA data, which is another match based on address. Okay. And the Info USA match is going to lose us about another 1,500 people, right? And then when we combine that with the problems that we sometimes have getting the CoreLogic match, we can get down to a fairly small sample where we can have predicted prices from CoreLogic, and we can have Info USA data matched in, putting that all together. Okay, so that's the sort of the progression of data loss. Is just the main reason for showing that. Yeah.
Who should we think about being systematically lost through this?
Didn't add it. When you add in Info USA in particular, you tend to make the sample more urban. You tend to then lose more white people. That's sort of a big part of it. You also tend to lose poorer people because Info USA has a hard time tracking people who sort of saw some of the things they like to track people based on. Who aren't wine lovers, right? Are going to be less likely to be in their sample. People don't buy books online. Those are the kinds of people that we lose primarily because of Info USA. The CoreLogic loss is a little less directed because it's really bad addresses. There we do tend to lose rural places though, because rural places are going to be the ones that don't have as many data points to run the regression. I already had it up, that I'm going to show you next. Okay. All right. So here's the prediction. We just want to know what are the houses going to be worth so we can compare them to what CoreLogic tells us FEMA paid. So we're going to run a regression, and the things that are in it to try to like capture all the stuff you'd worry about are basically going to be block grouped by year fixed effects. So within a block group, fairly small area to start with, every year we're going to be pulling out everything else, right, that's specific to that, and then using within variation to get the effect, right, of basically everything else in there that we'd be interested in, all the other house values. So our house characteristics. So the prediction we're going to argue is going to capture a lot of unobservable stuff, fairly localized unobservable stuff. But the question earlier about flood risk could cut through a block group. This is why we want to get the mapping done and add that in as another variable there. Okay, but this means we got to run 741 different regressions because all of the coefficients that are in there are going to be county specific. And sometimes you just don't have enough observations in a county, in a particular rural county. The regression just might not produce usable estimates. Yeah, Serena.
To clarify, so this, you're doing block year fixed effects. So this is like a prediction for the same block group in the same year, which means it's a post-disaster.
We're taking out the disaster data. So everything here is either pre-disaster or non-disaster. But in the same county where there could have been a disaster.
You're taking, okay.
So we're taking out the places where there was the buyout so that we're not getting in there the data where the houses had been destroyed or damaged, but maybe were sold, right?
Okay, so you're saying that you don't just take out the actual buyouts from the transactions, but you're also taking out the areas where
the areas where the buyouts occurred get sold, right? So
areas that are affected by the disaster that aren't out areas.
Sorry, hold on. Now I'm trying. So we're going to take out. I'm sorry. We're going to take out the buyout houses. For sure. We're going to leave in the houses, but we're going to go prior to when the buyout occurred, prior to when the disaster occurred, for the houses that were not bought out, but were in the same block group with the buyout houses. So the idea here is there should never be a house in this data set that was flooded at the time it was sold. Okay. Okay.
And the buyouts, because they're happening, often a couple of years after.
Yeah, within a year, a lot of times, but up to 2 years. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just wondering how you have pre-disaster data for those areas. If you're doing block year fixed effects, like it's a different fixed effect for each year in the same block group. Maybe that
Are you
is,
just worried that the buyout is occurring 2 years later? So therefore, we're not gonna know that the flood occurred 1 year later? That we have some flooded houses within there? Is that?
yeah, basically.
Okay. It's a good question. Let me come back. Let me talk to you about. I think we've dealt with that, but yeah, this is getting into the real weeds of what we pulled. But it's a good question. Let me kind of, yeah.
I have a separate question, which is,
Okay.
have you done this for just like assessed values or appraised values that you have?
No, we just use the transaction values.
It's interesting to see if the,
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally not a fan of assessed values for running hedonic regressions in general. You get back the bad model that the assessor used. And in different places, that model is worse than in other places.
it would just be interesting to see if that is reflecting.
Yeah.
The prices that are being paid out.
This is the distribution of the differences. Okay, so I'm jumping now to, we ran the model, we predicted the prices. We're gonna take what FEMA said or what CoreLogic told us FEMA paid. We're gonna take the difference between those things. And what's interesting is all of these have means that are below 0. Okay, so you and I were talking about flooding yesterday. You had mentioned that there was some cases where some places might use post-disaster data. I talked to Lala about that. Everything we've read suggests that the data we have doesn't have that, but we got to dig into that more. If it did, it might explain why even white households get paid less, right? But this could also be, you don't use all of your flood insurance payment to buy things at Home Depot, and they do take some of it off, right? In general, there's reasons why people are gonna not get maybe the full value. But what we see is if the deduction for a white household is about, these are in tens of thousands of dollars, it's about $49,000, $50,000. For the black household, it's 65, and for the Hispanic household, it's 77,000. Okay, so there's a pretty clear just racial difference if we just look at the raw distributions. And here is if we go ahead and we run a regression, and we can kind of look at how that varies based on what we put into the hedonic regression as controls. Okay, tracked by year down to block group by year with block group and year and tracked by year in the middle. It's roughly going to be about 10% lower payment relative to your house value if you're black. Okay, and 8 or so % if you're Hispanic. Now we're going to come later to things that might be correlated with race here. That'll be at the very last slide. I promise I'll get to it. And I'll just sort of jump to the conclusion there in case I don't. The Hispanic result is very fragile. There's other things that can explain that. The black result is very robust. Nothing really gets rid of that. Okay, but you'll see that later. Yeah.
So can you just talk a bit about the X's that are, the house level X's that are in there? Cause this gets back to I guess the concern would be that you're over predicting prices for black houses.
Yeah.
Because you don't know whether the kitchen was renovated. And so the average house in the block group is getting largely the price of the average house in that block group.
Yeah, I mean, renovations, you're gonna not know if this is sort of a standard hedonic.
Yeah, so like right where it says here will be upwardly biased for minority households for the exact reason that properties tax assessments are.
Yeah, I mean, so we are gonna later, we're going to use the race of the buyer, we're gonna use the race of the owner in this regression. And the effects are actually gonna get bigger. This is a robustness check. We're doing it, we weren't doing it so much because of the renovation story, but we're the Pat Bayer et al. Story of black households pay too much for the same house, right? Because they have search frictions and they don't want to go look more because they're not going to be allowed to buy another house later, so they overbid. So we put that in because we're worried about that, and it actually, the effects get bigger. What I'm showing you here is a lower bound relative to that. Okay. but that would pick up the fact if Black households renovated their units more often on average, that would pick it up too. So that'll show up later. Okay, yeah, and then I won't go into a ton of detail, but we can do different qualities of match. So if you get really strict about the address matching between CoreLogic and FEMA, the number actually goes up, sample goes down, but the number gets bigger. And we can also try to match on the last names that FEMA gives us. Remember I said that sometimes those are missing. So if we do that, we end up losing sample. But if you're worried that there could be, you know, two addresses and they're not, you know, two people at the same address, we match on the last name and the effect doesn't go away. So we feel like it's pretty robust, especially the number for the Black household. Okay, so that's the first result. That's actually, let me check one thing here. So we were trying to get a result out of the census RDC at the University of Kentucky today. And apparently we don't have it yet. I'll check one more time before the end, and so I can tell you more stuff about census data. But for now, nothing I can say. The wealth data, so this is getting into the index, right? That you may or may not have confidence in its ability to actually measure wealth, but it's measuring something, and it's what InfoUSA gives us. And what's kind of nice about it relative to income, which they also impute, is we think that a lot of what the impacts of a flood would be on a household, and in particular, sort of what you might be dealing with 2, 3, 4, 5 years after the flood, may not be income at all. People can go get a new job, but it may drain your savings, right? I mean, it's oftentimes more of a permanent shock to your wealth than it is a transitory shock to your income. All right, so we're going to use this for now and see if we can get anything out of it. But we're going to look at what happens to wealth based on race, pre and post shock. Okay, and in a minute we'll go in. It's all on the same slide here. We'll look at how that varies with the size of the discount, measured in tens of thousands of dollars. Okay, so there's a very clear, very significant effect on this InfoUSA Wealth Index for Black households. Okay, so these regressions are Black households versus the white households in InfoUSA, and then Hispanic households versus the white households. Just to be clear on the two separate regressions. Here's what it looks like in a picture. Okay, some more of an event study year to year, and you can see maybe there's a little bit of a pre-trend, but the Black wealth drops pretty substantially and continues to drop after the flood year, right? So this is not, or the year of the buyout, I should be clear. It's not sort of something that just stops and then things get better. Right? So there's potentially some compounding effects going on. Interestingly, we don't see anything specifically when we look at InfoUSA's income variable, right? Which doesn't necessarily surprise me. People in Katrina moved to Houston and found work there, right? Many of them found temporary work relatively quickly. Their incomes might not have changed very much at all. I mean, these are negative, but they're not significant. But the problem would be, what are they doing to their bank accounts while they're sitting there in Houston waiting to either move back to Louisiana or not, right? That's a pretty extreme example, but the same idea, you know, could be showing up in other places. So then what we can do, so that's just looking purely what happens after, is ask how what happens after interacts with the discount, right? So the thing we were kind of interested in here is, well, there's this discount, it's like 10%, that's bad, right? We don't want to see disparities like that in impacts from a federal program, but does it matter? Clearly it matters somewhat because they're getting less money, but like, what does that actually do? So we'll just basically throw in one more interaction and ask, how big is the change in wealth later, depending upon the size of that impact? So this was a 12% reduction in the wealth index. For somebody who has no deduction in the value of their home, it's a 9%. If they're a Black household, 9% reduction. But this number down here, 0.008, if you think about the median reduction for a Black household, it was about $60,000, right? So that number here then would get multiplied by 6. That's basically half the size of this number up here. It's a 50% increase in the size of the reduction in Black wealth for the average discount in house value, right? So just from a wealth perspective, the discount is pretty big in what it does to the household afterwards. Okay, some of that could be direct, but we're talking here about bigger amounts of money. Some of it is going to have something to do with your ability to respond to a shock. That's kind of the way we're thinking about it. We actually see it then for yeah, question, Jeff.
Should I be puzzled that the discount doesn't seem to matter for white?
This number here, I mean, it's an order of magnitude smaller, but it's significant. Say again.
Got stars, but it's tiny compared to the Black number.
Yeah, I mean, it's an order of magnitude. So this is why I think there's more to it than simply the discount reduces your wealth. It's not just that. There's something about being Black and having less wealth following a shock is worse than being white and having less wealth following a shock, right? In terms of moving forward in your wealth, right? So exactly. Yeah.
Do you have any information, so like when we're measuring wealth, like is there information that on average, like a Black family, like the thing counted as wealth is the house? So if you no longer have a house, but then maybe on average in white population, there's house and investments and blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
other things. So like, is there?
Yeah, I mean, so that actually is kind of what's interesting is I don't think the InfoUSA wealth measure is capturing as much of that as would using sort of like Experian data or one of the like real wealth measures. So real wealth data, I think, could start to actually break those things apart. Because I do think, yeah, a lot of the wealth of white households is being captured in things that didn't get washed away, right? Here, it's more about what you're spending your money on, right? So yeah, it's just a different kind of a thing we're looking at that doesn't answer your question.
But it might help explain like why the impact on wealth is so bad for, right? For Black.
Well, I mean, I think it would explain it more if we could separate it out by the, you know, stocks and house, and then we would see that the house value go down and that would actually, right? But also to that point, right, these are people who did a buyout. So their house value is supposed to be like captured by the buyout. We know that the size of the reduction is a direct hit off of that, right? So that would probably explain some of this to this part down here, because this just means you're getting less money for your house, and for a Black household, that's a big part of their wealth. So
I was thinking of that graph you showed earlier that had the, you know, like the impacts of wealth just keep going down and down and down, you know, like it's worse and worse.
yeah, I mean, that's the part, that picture there was more of the wrong way, more the thing that says to me that there's something more about how you deal with the shock is different if you're Black versus white. Right? And something 2 years, 3 years later after the buyout is still impacting you. And there are these sort of debt spirals and things like that where problems accumulate if you don't have wealth to begin with, right? I think that's what this kind of story says. So yeah, we are kind of, we're seeing if we can get Experian data to give us some measures of debt following, right? Which would be one way to look at sort of another measure of wealth, kind of on the reverse side, but we're not there yet on the Experian. For 2 questions, yeah.
So between the flood and the buyout, is there a moratorium program for the mortgages, or are they still having to pay the mortgage while they're out of their house?
Yeah.
Or does it depend on their bargaining power with the bank?
Yeah, I mean, you can, the servicers can sometimes get you into it, like they'll suspend payments sometimes if the disaster declaration is significant enough, right? So there are forbearance programs and things. For small things, for small floods, I'm guessing that they don't often get suspensions of mortgage payments, right? So people start going into default, and the question, or The question will just be whether they actually end up getting foreclosed upon before they can do the, right? That would actually probably be another reason why, if you don't have the savings to just keep paying it, because you're also moving out and paying to live somewhere, you may end up having to just take the buyout faster because they come collecting.
And non-whites are paying higher mortgage, like higher interest rates on their mortgages, I assume too. And so like,
Yeah.
their same house, they might be getting kind of worse.
That could be, especially, I mean, a lot of this is data from the 2000s, right? When that's definitely going to be a big factor. Yeah. Do you have questions, Serena?
Oh, yeah. Is it possible that more of the discount for white households, like the variation in discounts, is explained by this kind of subtractions due to NFIP payouts and IA and stuff like that?
Yeah, we'll come back later. I have one slide about the different participation in programs. But yeah, non-white households tend to be, white households are in flood insurance programs more often. So if they're getting payments, they should actually have bigger reductions. So that kind of works against the result we're getting. I'll have one result for that later. I'm gonna jump up a little bit here to get to it. The income effects do kick in when your discount is bigger. That's just one. We didn't find income effects at all until we explored how they vary. Okay, the last sort of thing to look at, and I'll show you one or two. A couple of things came up in terms of robustness. I just want to leave a second to talk about those at the end. But the main thing I want to do now is ask, well, what happens to the neighborhood that people live in, right? What kinds of neighborhoods are they in? So you'll see various neighborhood characteristics down here along the bottom that we've collected data on for all the places that they start in and that they go to. You'll notice flood risk is not one of them. We always get the question, like, do they move to another flooded place or flood risk place? That's where we're looking to get all the flood maps digitized, right? We thought we were going to do this with flood factor. If you know that data set, it's if you go onto Redfin and look at a house, you can see its flood score. That's flood factor. Getting the flood factor data has turned out to be more of a problem than I think it's going to be worth. So we'll digitize our own maps, but eventually that'll be on here too. But these are the this is a summary of all of this. Okay, so these are the estimates with their standard error bounds of the neighborhood, the changes in the neighborhood characteristics based on the size of the discount for each race group. So here it is for white. And you can see that white households basically kind of move into the same neighborhood that they were in before. Slightly less high school dropouts, slightly more ownership. Okay, so maybe there's a little bit of an upgrade in the neighborhood they're in, but nothing really big. For Hispanic households, we start to see some things show up, but not a lot of really strong, significant results. Maybe a few more single parent households. The skilled, your neighbors who are in skilled occupations goes up a little though. Households though that are linguistically isolated also tend to go up, and a little more renters. So this is kind of a mixed bag on the Hispanic side. But then for Black households, this is where things start to jump out. Okay, so we see a big increase in poverty rate in the neighborhood you're in. I'm going to put numbers on these in a second to make it easier to think about. But a big increase in the number of single parents, a big reduction in the number of skilled neighbors, and a reduction in ownership. So moving more often into a renter neighborhood. Yeah.
Do you have information about if these folks change from urban to rural or vice versa, and think about how that might interact?
Yeah, I mean, we could. I don't know that we looked at that, but we know the census tract. We know their address before and after.
Okay.
So yeah, we would know urban and rural. Yeah.
I would imagine you don't have to take your buyout and buy another house. So how
Take it and go rent.
much of this is explained by changes in home ownership?
And ownership. Well, I mean, the owner part of it, the last one would probably be explained by that to a large extent. The other characteristics though, so you would just want to see the graph separately for owners and renters.
I'm just
like in their
wondering how
exposed
much
stage.
we're seeing people sort into
Yeah.
neighborhoods depending on whether they're able to then purchase another home after the buyout.
Yeah, I mean, if they're not, then they're renting. It could be that they rent in a nicer neighborhood because it's cheaper, or they own in a lower quality neighborhood because it's more expensive, but they want to be an owner, right? But yeah, we could look at, we know if they rent or own, and we know where exactly they live. Yeah, is there one more question? Okay. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll try to wrap up here. Just to put a little bit of context on these numbers, this is a 4.4% increase in poverty. And this is for a $10,000 reduction in the size of your payout. That number is going to be on average for Black household 6, right? So that 4.4% increase in poverty, multiply that by 6, right? These are big numbers, okay? Not things to ignore, I think, in terms of the quality, the neighborhoods where people are ending up. Okay, so that's sort of the main 2 takeaways: the size of the discount and what it does to where people live. Let me just really quickly bounce through a couple of takeaways, or I'm sorry, not even takeaways, but threats, robustness checks that we'll do. We've gotten questions about, do certain kinds of people sort into the buyouts, right, based on characteristics that might make them good or bad bargainers, and does that vary by race? So we've taken a data set where we take all the buyout properties, and then we take all the properties that are within 500 feet of a buyout property. Because we don't know the houses that got offered a buyout and didn't take it. That's actually a really interesting thing to learn about if you have an opportunity to ever find data like that. But without that, we take the buffers around buyout houses. And we do see that, if you're richer and you have a more expensive house, you're more likely to take the buyout. Okay, which kind of makes sense. If you just lost your house and they're offering you a lot of money for it, you'll probably take it. Being Black does enter when we take a linear approach to measuring certain variables. It kind of varies depending upon the specification. But the key thing here is that interactions between things like InfoUSA's wealth measure and being Black don't matter. Okay? So if you're worried that all of the Black homeowners who enter into buyouts are low wealth, right? Or maybe they're more typically people who can't afford a lawyer or are more likely high school dropouts or things like that, right? We don't have lots of measures of that in InfoUSA, but the thing we can measure suggests there's not a lot of variation within race groups, right? According to those other characteristics. So unobserved characteristics, maybe we'd say they're not driving this. Who has flood insurance and who doesn't? If you're Black, Hispanic, or Asian, across the board, you're less likely to have flood insurance than if you're white. Okay, and this is by percentages of race and then measuring the total number of flood insurance policies or claims in census tracts. So to be clear, it's really hard to get the micro data on who has a flood insurance policy. There's a limited number of researchers around the world who use that data. This is the public stuff. So in a census tract, how many claims are there or how many policies are there and what percentage of the tract is Black, white, et cetera. Okay, but this would go in the opposite direction then of the flood insurance payout story, right? White people are getting more payouts, so they should actually have more reduction in their buyout from FEMA. This is the question earlier about, are we overstating the value of Black-owned households, right? Because of, the search costs and things like that. If you're a Black buyer, in other research, you pay too much for your house. So that can make it look then like they're getting undersold by FEMA, but FEMA's just paying what the house is actually worth if you didn't have that, right? So here we're going to control for, this is the buyer from the previous time the house was purchased. So this is the current owner at the time of the buyout, and we're controlling for their race in the price reduction regression. And that number actually is up to 19% instead of 10% for Black households. This is what I was saying earlier, that it gets bigger. We can also control for both the race of the person the owner of the house and the race of the person they bought it from before. So this might be going back 8-10 years or something, right? So when they bought the house, this is the indicator of racial biases in the transactions price that we would be getting out of that. Okay, so that doesn't explain things away. If anything, it actually just makes them get bigger. And then finally, we could look to say, maybe this isn't race at all, right? I think in any discrimination study, you want to look for the things that are correlated with race and ask if that wipes away the race part. I want to be clear, if it does, that doesn't mean discrimination didn't happen. Okay, what it means is that there could be some other variable that soaks that effect up. And then it gets more complicated as to how race is injected into different parts of the world and the things that it works itself through, right? Credit scores for Black borrowers are lower, and you can put credit scores into a regression and race might go away. That doesn't mean that there's no discrimination. It means it's going through a different channel. So here we'll put in things like wealth and income. And when we do that, I said the Hispanic effect is fairly fragile. There it goes, poof, right? The Black effect doesn't go anywhere. In fact, it gets a little bit bigger. The one interesting thing is that we do find that the size of the discount is actually quite a bit bigger. The Hispanic effect goes away, but the linguistic isolation effect jumps in, which if we go back to the discussion about lawyers and the ability to bargain, that to me kind of speaks to that. Okay, that was it. I'm out of time. I think, yes, even on the that was really it. So I'll stop because, yeah.
Join me in thanking